Welcome, everyone. This is the Inform online seminar series, and we're here today to celebrate the launch of Beth Singler and Eileen Barker's new book, Radical Transformations in Minority Religions, which will turn out backwards. We have started the recording. I'm just going to give an introduction and then we'll get started. I'm Suzanne Newcomb. I'm the Honorary Director of Inform and the lecturer in Religious Studies at Open University. And as I'm sure almost everyone in attendance knows, Inform is an independent educational charity that provides information about minority religions and sects, which we hope is as accurate, up-to-date, and evidence-based as possible. We exist to prevent harm based on misinformation about minority religions and sects by bringing in the insights and methods of academic research into the public domain. And Inform was founded in 1988 by Professor Eileen Barker, one of our co-editors this evening. And it was originally at the London School of Economics, funded by direct support of the UK Home Office. We moved to the Department of Theology and Religious Studies here at King's College London in 2018. Please feel free to email us after the seminar if you have any thoughts, any questions, either about minority religions or about the events of tonight itself. We're always happy to have your feedback and ideas. So we are going to be recording this evening. We're going to be recording speaker view and make it available on YouTube afterwards for people who weren't able to be here tonight. If you want to ask questions at the end, there'll be a space for you to do so. If you want to ask questions anonymously, if you use the direct messaging to me, Suzanne Newcomb, I can read your messages on your behalf and you won't appear in the recording in any way and no one will know who asked them. Otherwise, feel free to type your messages in or raise your hand virtually at the end and I will share a general question and answer. So this is the latest book in the Routledge Inform book series. It's the 15th book that Inform edited collection that Inform has done. And I will put a link to the entire series in the chat box in just a second. We are going to have 3 respondents who are going to comment on the book. The first one will be Professor Linda Woodhead, and then we'll hear from Michael Langoni and then Professor Jim Beckford. Then we'll give a chance for the editors to respond, and then there's quite a few contributors to the book who will be given a chance to make any comments after that. And finally, we'll open it up for general question and answers. So our first speaker or respondent is Professor Linda Woodhead, who we're very pleased to welcome as the new head of department for theology and religious studies here at King's College London. She is the F.D. Maurice professor. And prior to this, she's familiar to many of us in the audience from her long-term roles at Lancaster, her incredible public speaking on religion and society, religion and values, and there's too much to say about her, so I will just let her speak because she does it very eloquently.
Thank you very much, Suzanne, and thanks to the officers of Inform and to the authors of this book for this invitation to comment on a really significant collection of essays, Radical Transformations in Minority Religions. In the introduction to this book, Beth Singler, one of the editors, offers a definition of a new religious movement or a minority religion that provides a useful starting point for all the contributors to the book to understand why minority religions may be especially susceptible to change. And it actually provides a very nice glue, which gives a coherence to the volume, I thought. This definition that's so useful in this book derives from Eileen Barker's work, and it describes a new religion or defines a new religious movement in terms of 3 characteristics. First, that it is predominantly first generation. Second, that there's often leadership with charismatic authority. And third, that it exposes alternative beliefs, alternative to mainstream religious views. So those are three characteristics of an NRM, predominantly first generation leadership that often has charismatic authority and that it expresses alternative beliefs to mainstream religious views. Well, once you start thinking about the whole question of change in relation to those, you've got a really useful battery of reasons, factors, hypotheses for trying to understand why this variety of religion might be particularly prone to change. And in particular, again, from Eileen Barker's work, to two kinds of change: revisionism and or diversification, which can include splitting. So if you think about it and those characteristics, you can see why they might lead to this propensity for change. And reading through the contributions, they do exemplify that way of explaining it. And so some of the most common explanations that come out of the case studies and discussions for rapid change have to do with these factors. First, interactions with wider society, or as one contributor calls it, outside pressure on the minority religion for change. And this can also be named, and is by some, as the search for legitimacy. And that includes incorporation into legal frameworks, including being officially defined as a religion for legal purposes. So there's a cluster of reasons for change, which have to do with pressures coming from wider structures in society. And a second reason for rapid change may have to do with what another contributor calls new revelations. And new revelations is quite a theme of this book. New revelations come quite frequently in the cases that are discussed here. And of course, this is tied in with charismatic authority and the ability of individuals to channel new insights, new revelations, and God-given messages, or to claim divine status for themselves, to be unique spokespersons for the supernatural. Then thirdly, the fact that minority religions, when they move from first generation founders to second and third generations, there is often rebellion and or revisionism going on. So there's a generational explanation for change there, thirdly. And then another factor actually that several pieces very interestingly discuss, that isn't implicit, I think, in Eileen's definition, is technology, new technologies, and technological change also being a factor in change in minority religions. And it's the internet, of course, that is most discussed here, and social media, as a factor which at the very least can accelerate change or enable change as a medium, at the very least. And there's some interesting reflection on how and why it can do that. Okay, that's my sort of overview of some general themes coming out of the book and their theoretical underpinning. And now for my contribution and my questions. Whilst it could be, and generally is, subsumed under one of these headings I've just discussed, reading the chapters, starting with Eileen Barker's fascinating reflections on the exposure and the aftermath of child sexual abuse in a number of minority religions, made me wonder whether there was a further factor that we should include when we're thinking about change in minority religions, and that as social scientists, which I guess most of the contributors are, not all, but many, we hardly ever do include it. And it is to do with ethical let's call it moral leadership. Let's be really unfashionable and call it moral courage or moral leadership. So it's even verging on personal virtues and moral character. A very taboo factor for social scientists that is very rarely talked about or mentioned. So I'm talking, I suppose, about values, both in the sense of a social phenomenon, the values, the mores of a social group or a society, but I'm also talking about individuals as the bearers of values and those who enact them in their lived practices. Now, right from the start in Eileen's opening chapter, that this factor does appear. So Eileen Barker, in talking about child sexual abuse in some minority religions, does talk about good men and women as a major reason why change comes about in relation to dealing with sexual abuse or not dealing with it. She also talks about leaders and founders who are not what you would call good men as a factor in why abuse happens. And she talks about good men and women who do something. That's a quote from page 31. Good men and women who do something as a very significant factor in positive change to address sexual abuse. So here are my questions, and therefore any and all of the contributors. First of all, is it Max Weber's fault that we never talk about ethics and values? Because when he talks about the three main sorts of authority, bureaucratic, traditional, and charismatic, does that exclude morality, ethics, values as a factor? And does his understanding of charisma exclude ethical action? I think in a way it does, and for this reason, because if you have moral courage, you're acting against a norm, and that often leads to stigmatization, to shame, to marginalization and exclusion. So we know that moral pioneers are very rarely celebrated. They are not understood as charismatic. On the contrary, first generation moral pioneers are usually forgotten, marginalized, neglected. It's when you get second or third generations picking up on their moral lead that you start to get them celebrated as heroes on the whole. So Helen Lind, some of you might remember, one of the co-authors of that famous study of Middletown, wrote a book called Shame. And her question was, if social change comes through people who go against the mainstream, those people have to bear shame. What makes it possible for some people to be shame bearers? So far from being charismatic, having moral courage may be the opposite. So is it Weber's fault? That's my first question. And can we include moral leadership under charisma? I'm not sure we can. My second question, why is talking about good men and women so taboo in social scientific study, or considering virtue as a factor worthy of consideration? And thirdly, should it be taboo? Are there good reasons? I can think of some reasons why using things like moral character became so taboo. I can think of some good reasons for that, but do those reasons still pertain? That's my third and final question. Thank you all very much for listening.
Fantastic. Just in the right time. Thank you very much for your reflections. Our next respondent is Michael Langone, who's joining us from sunny Florida. He is the executive director of the International Cultic Studies Association and the founding editor of the journal Cultic Studies Review, previously the Cultic Studies Journal. And he's been a long time follower of all things new and potentially problematic in terms of religious movements, and a long-term communication with Inform and Eileen across the pond. So Michael, we look forward to hearing your thoughts. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm coming from somewhat of a different perspective. First of all, mental health, psychological rather than sociological. And the organization I work with focuses on casualties. If you looked at our network statistically, about half of the people in it are former members of groups. And about half of them now is second generation or third generation. And the other 50% are a mixture of mental health professionals, other helpers like clergy, family members concerned about loved ones, researchers, graduate students, and smattering of educators. So we have a focus on harm, which academicians would not necessarily be focused on. They may be aware of it, but it's not going to be a focus. But this book is nonetheless useful because I think people in our network will tend to overgeneralize from the casualties that come to them. And this book illustrates that there's much more variety among groups than those of us who focus on casualties would be aware of. So for example, the chapters on Jediism, Asatru, Paganism, this is interesting. We don't see people coming from such groups very rarely, if ever. Whereas others like the family, ISKCON, Church Universal and Triumphant, the Brethren, we will get casualties, people who have come to us seeking help because of their experiences in these groups. And usually for most helpers, especially mental health, frequently their clients are their primary sources of information, and they have to make a special effort to read books like this in order to get a broader view of the forest rather than just the trees that are, whose leaves aren't as green as they should be. And we often don't necessarily keep up with changes. So for example, in this book, I didn't know about the digitization of the family. And that's a pretty radical change in a group that has caused a lot of consternation because of the sexual abuse history. But it's useful for helpers to know that these changes are occurring. The common assumption I think that we all can share is that some groups harm some people sometimes. And there are chapters in this book that really, especially Eileen's chapter on child abuse, that goes into the harm in some detail. And it's helpful, I think, for people in the network I come from to realize that even groups themselves can deal with the harm. We've had a long-standing dialogue with ISKCON, especially through Anuta Madasa. So we are aware of that, but I don't think we're as aware of other groups. The family, there's some awareness of that. And we can disagree about the nature, the causes, the magnitude of harm in different groups, but one can't deny that harm does occur. My personal feeling is I think we need better theories in the field. The sociological paradigms don't illuminate the internal psychodynamics, even though they can describe harm. The preferred paradigms in our network tend to apply mainly to extreme cases because they derive from Lifton's thought reform, studies of Chinese prisoners of war, brainwashing, mind control. But as the late Ben Zablocki, sociologist from Rutgers, pointed out, thought reform, he was a defender of the term brainwashing. He was trying to keep the term brainwashing, even though many of us, both in sociology as well as in our own network, find the brainwashing term to be misleading because of the connotations it has in the general public. But Zablocki was arguing that there is an extreme form of influence. His point was that thought reform is a choice that a leader makes, that he puts resources into getting a level of control over people, that they become what he called deployable agents. But whether Zablocki is right or wrong is irrelevant to most cases, because most cases that we see, most groups that we deal with are not that extreme. People may be hurt, and there may be a range of psychologically manipulative techniques that are used to hurt them, but it is not necessarily to the extent of being a full thought reform or brainwashing program. I think Eileen's statement about good people doing anything to prevent the triumph of evil, and what contributions did some of these people eventually make towards radically changing that context, is important, because I think implicitly it's pointing to psychological factors that need to be considered as well. You know, inside the person, you can have different levels of faith in the core religious belief of the group. And a person can have different subjective evaluations of the probability that reform can actually be made and be successful. In ISKCON, we've seen that in our conferences and discussions with Anutama and other ISKCON members, and former members like Nori Muster, who wrote Betrayal of the Spirit, Stephen Gelberg. And it's been interesting to me in discussions with them that part of the difference is that Anutama, for example, still has faith in the core religious beliefs of ISKCON, of Hinduism, and he thinks that the organization can be salvaged, and he's worked to reform it. Nori, gets along with Anutama. She just does not have that level of faith, and she doesn't think that the organization can be salvaged. So, how people respond, you can have good people, some of whom give up, some of whom try to bring about change in the organization. And it's individual factors that determine who does that and who doesn't do it. And it isn't necessarily that people who don't try to bring about change are not good people. They just may have a different subjective evaluation of whether or not it's worth the effort to try to bring about change. Another thing that I'd like to point out is that victims who have experienced severe abuse, especially child sexual abuse, may interpret reports of change as implicit requests for forgiveness that they cannot give. And helpers, such as mental health professionals, may feel an obligation to support such victims. And this can cause some distortions, because as is pointed out in chapters in this book, groups do change, and sometimes they change for the better. And victims may be reluctant to even accept that that's true. And groups that are changing, such as ISKCON and the family, I think need to respect the fact that for some victims, nothing they do, no amount of change, and no matter how sincere the motivation, is going to make things right with all abuse victims. So if one is working toward change in an organization that has had problems with harming people, I think one should change because it's the right thing to do, not because it's going to eliminate criticism. Dialogue is important, especially dialogue, I think, between researchers and helping professionals, between those that are looking at the forest and those that are looking at the casualties, because it helps both maintain a more balanced perspective on the phenomena. Within our own network, we have an enduring tension between professionals who seek to be accurate and victims, especially recently exited victims, who may interpret all attempts at dialogue as unjustified attempts to exonerate abusers. I mean, this tension can constrain helpers whose first duty is to victims. We especially run into this tension in our conferences, which current members may attend. For instance, Anuta Madasa has attended many of our conferences in full Krishna garb. And the tension is really between the desire among some to be open and to engage in dialogue with cult members such as Anuta, with sociologists and others, and some people wanting to feel safe and validated, and people who want to support those. So we are always wrestling with that. And part of the way we've tried to deal with that is by having certain special activities that are safe. Like we have a workshop every year for second generation farmer members. And that's not a place where there's a lot of openness and dialogue. The focus is on the pain that people have felt. And I think researchers need to understand that sometimes the writings of helpers, particularly mental health professionals, can vary according to the context. If I'm writing for victims, I'm not going to necessarily emphasize the nuance that one would see in this book on radical transformations, because I have a different purpose, I have a different audience. If I'm writing for a professional group, then I might get into that. So if I'm writing for researchers, I would have a different focus in what I'm writing. So for instance, with mental health professionals, I'm always and repeatedly emphasizing that we see a self-selected sample of casualties and that we have to be careful not to overgeneralize from our self-selected sample. But I'm not going to emphasize that if I'm writing something that's aimed at people who are hurting and are trying to get their lives back together. And I think researchers need to understand and evaluate such writings according to what the audience is and the goals are of the writings. But it's the dialogue and that's most important. And I hope that there can be that more people within our network can pay attention to the kinds of ideas that are described in this book, and that those of you who are focused more on research can delve in greater detail into the people who are hurt. And the hurt is perhaps most conspicuous when you're dealing with child sexual abuse, but people get hurt in other ways. There's a sense of betrayal. Someone is presented what amounts to a public relations view of a group, and they buy into it and they think it's going to be a wonderful thing for them and it's going to change their life. And disillusionment follows and they feel betrayed, they feel hurt. Sometimes there's financial exploitation that goes on. Sometimes people are just bullied for long periods of time and they come out and they're in pain. That does not mean that everybody in the group has the same experience. We will see those that have those kinds of experiences. We don't see those that manage to maintain a level of autonomy, even in a powerful group, and who may leave the group and think that, well, they learned certain things from it, but there were things that were bad about it, and they have a a different kind of perspective on their experience from the person who comes out deeply depressed and in need of help. So I'll end it there. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Michael, for those really important reflections and important contextualization of the different perspectives we bring to this. So for our third reaction, we're going to turn to James Beckford, who is a former chair of the Board of Governors of Inform, who is now happily retired from his academic work and completely independent to offer his opinions.
Wow, that's dangerous. Thank you very much. And it's wonderful to see so many faces on the screen whom I recognize, old timers from Inform meetings going back many, many years. Hello to you all, whatever the time of day or night it is where you are. It's always exciting to open a new book for the first time. And I was very excited to receive this one. So thank you to Inform for inviting me to give some comments on it at its official launch. The book is welcome to me for many, many reasons, but partly selfishly because it takes me back to my earliest days as a researcher. My first article on the Unification Church was published 50 years ago this year. So there's an element of nostalgia, but more importantly, it's also good to see evidence of how much some of the old movements and the old debates, the old issues have changed. And there are some wonderful new ideas and new faces, and that's all welcome. And the book is a wonderful shop window in that respect. I'm going to divide my presentation into two parts. First, some general impressions, and then some more specific picky points. First of all, the general impression. The volume has substance and pedigree. That's important. It has heft. It's solid. 17 chapters, an index, some intriguing photos, and it fits well into the Routledge Informed series, what was the Ashgate Informed series at the beginning, on minority religions and spiritual movements that Eileen has been editing since its very beginning. And this volume dovetails neatly with the volume that she edited in 2013 on revisionism and diversification in new religious movements. So there's a lot of continuity here, as well as new stuff. So the book comes from a good stable, to put it crudely. It has a pedigree, and that's all to the good. And it makes an important, and as Linda said, significant contribution. That's the first general impression. Second one is that the book, and I speak here as an inveterate editor, is well balanced. It's well balanced in various ways. It covers a good variety of minority religions. Contributors come from many different countries, different standpoints. Some are insiders, some are outsiders, some are ex-members, some are current members, and so on and so on. And the researchers themselves are very varied. Some have a lot of experience, some are gaining it. So there's a good balance between the different approaches here. And with each new chapter, I found my interest was rekindled. I started again, and I did read it from cover to cover because of this variety. Third general impression is that all that diversity I'm talking about now is channeled to good effect by Beth Singler's introduction. She weaves most of the strands together very well into I think, a persuasive argument without trying to impose a rigid organization on them. There's no heavy framework to which all the contributors had to conform, and that's very good. But it does all pull roughly in the same direction. But there is an oddity here, and I'll put down a marker, because I'm going to come back to it. The word radical, it's in the title of the book, Radical Transformations. It doesn't appear once in Beth's introduction. Now, that may not be important. It may be one of the picky points, but it does strike me as odd, and that's why I'll come back to it. So, take stock, general impressions, book of substance, pedigree, well-balanced, operating within a flexible framework, all to the good. And I'll continue with good points, but more specifically. First observation I make, and this is perhaps because of my age, is that I can see in this book the virtue, the value of repeated and continuous study of movements over the long haul. You can see in a number of chapters that this pays off handsomely for people who are thoroughly immersed in their fields of study. But there's a delicious irony in the fact that I think the most innovative chapter is the one written by the most experienced researcher, namely Eileen. Her careful examination of the context in which the sexual abuse of children was allowed to happen in 3 minority religions, and in which some people were eventually able to change the situations radically, I think is a testament to the virtue of studying the same movements over long periods of time. She's been there, she's stayed at it, she's tracked them. And it results in a wonderful chapter, which is really very innovative. Her main question, what did they do about child sexual abuse? What did they do? Such an obvious question. It never crossed my mind to ask that question. I think this is an ingenious approach which yields some surprising findings, interesting ones. And I think the findings of her chapter fully justify the use of the word radical to describe the extent to which transformation was made to happen in the groups that she was studying, International Society for Krishna Consciousness, Children of God, or Family International, and the Jesus Fellowship Church. But there are other chapters in addition to Eileen's that also demonstrate the value of long-term study of particular minority religions. I'm thinking of Claire Borowick's latest update on the implications of the truly radical reboot of the Family International, or of Andrew Dawson's long-term monitoring of developments in the Brazilian movement of Santo Daime, particularly with all kinds of diversification going on in that movement, and the diversification carries on. So the value of long-term, careful study, methodical study of movements pays off in this book. Second, and perhaps by contrast, alongside those chapters benefiting from long-term study, there are many innovations and some eye-catching developments in movements that I knew very little, if anything, about. And I think that's always welcome in an edited book. You don't want to read an edited book about which you know everything. You want some surprises, and this book provides them. I was particularly impressed by the chapter on strikingly different patterns of ritual change in 2 main centers of the Mexican movement, Santa Muerte, by Stefano Biardi, Fabrizio Lorusso, and Stefano Morone. I thought this was a wonderful contribution. I could also see some tantalizing but rather frustratingly unexplored links between these changes in Santa Muerte in Mexico and the phenomenon of what Beth Singler calls retconning in her chapter on Jediism. This caused me to do some mental gymnastics. I think I got my head around it in the end. It refers to the intriguing idea that the cultural and commercial aspects of the Star Wars industry are being retroactively corrected or retconned by its owners in the face of the emergence of a real world movement of Jedi. So this amounts to rewriting the history of the Star Wars universe in such a way that audiences would accept that this is the way that it had always been. So the tension between the original and the modified canon in a movement like that is one of the forces that is transforming the Jedi movement. And I saw echoes of that in other chapters. I thought Andre van der Brack's chapter, for example, on the followers of the American spiritual leader Andrew Cohen, that I had only known by its original name, the Moksha Foundation, also picked up on that tension between original and modified canon. So, to sum up, there are a lot of new thoughts here, new movements, new people, new ideas, alongside the longer running studies of more experienced researchers. One more general observation, and you knew I would do this. It's about the missing dimensions the missing topics. No edited collection is ever perfect, certainly none that I've ever edited. Readers can always find weaknesses or omissions. This volume is no different, but I do want to make it clear that I think Beth and Eileen have succeeded in ironing out any unevenness between the chapters. It all reads very smoothly, it all fits together, no problem with that. But there are a few quibbles. Go back to an earlier point about the introductory chapter, the word radical. I'm not convinced, having read the whole book, that all or indeed many of the transformations analysed in the book deserve to be called radical. The case remains open, and that's good because we can have much more debate about that. It is a word that's always good to discuss, good to think with, and it will be interesting to hear people's views on what they think is radical in religion and what is not. Yeah. Second quibble, and here I'm really asking for the moon, is about the range of movements. The book, as I said earlier, contains a wide variety of religions. The variety of movements is quite astonishing, and every chapter certainly deserves a place in the book. And that's a great cause for satisfaction, but what happened to Japan, Africa, the Middle East, or China? We've grown used to reading things about new religions in all those areas of the world, and I'm particularly interested in some of them myself. And so I did feel that the book would have been stronger had it made an inroad into at least one of those areas, that's all. But as I said, that's asking for the moon. But since I'm in the critic's chair, I'm going to avail myself of the privilege. And then final quibble, and actually it's a bee in my bonnet that's been buzzing there for a long time, is the relative lack of connection between the chapters and the literature on any types of social movement. Social movements were one of the things that I was most interested in my own career, and I can see so many opportunities for good connections in the literature between what students of social movements have written and what students of religious movements have written. But those connections are so rarely made. I've been nudging people for decades. Nobody listens. So I've got another chance to complain. Now, unfortunately, I don't have time to talk about all the other aspects of the book that truly deserve comment. Every chapter raises interesting questions. Some, like Frank Cranmer and Russell Sandberg's chapter, for example, on legal regulation, they challenge our complacency. They challenge the complacency about the legal struggles that still face minority religions in spite of the introduction of legal protections for human rights and equalities in the United Kingdom. And other chapters like Carl Siegfried's chapter on Asatru and the broader system of heathenry, they shock us. They shock us into recognition that notions of, in inverted commas, race can still be implicated in religion. That was quite a shock. And finally, Eugene Gallagher's chapter on Satanist movements, I think, reminds us very helpfully that not all transformations succeed and not all transformations lead to schisms. There are other ways to develop what could be equally radical. So I'm out of time. Let me just finish by congratulating Beth and Eileen again, as well as all the contributors for their fine work in this book. It's a book that will be very rewarding to a lot of people, whether they are professional students of religion or whether they are people with other interests in minority religions. It really doesn't matter. And they've shone this light without stirring up undue controversy and without inciting vigilantism. And that's always a good thing. So I'm happy to have had just a very small part in easing this new ship on its launch day, down its launch slip. If only we had a bottle of champagne to break on its bow. Non-alcoholic, of course.
Thank you so much for that lovely summary and reflections. There's been so many rich reflections on both the book as a whole and individual contributors' offerings within the book. And I'm aware that also we haven't been able to detail every individual contributor's contribution. So just to remind people of the format, I'm going to ask Beth to respond and then Eileen to respond. And then I'm going to give space for the contributors who might be here tonight. So after Beth and Eileen talk, if contributors want to raise your hand, and then after that, I will open it up to questions that anyone in the audience might have. And again, we are recording this, it will be posted on YouTube. And so if you want to ask an anonymous question, send me, Suzanne Newcomb, a direct message, and I will ask a question on your behalf, and therefore you won't be recorded in any way. So Beth, with her beautiful selection of books in the series behind her, if you want to make any responses, thanks.
Thank you. Oh, such wonderful comments and really stimulating questions as well. So I want to initially start by thanking the reviewers' respondents for their comments and for their deep and engaged reading of the book. And I'm very pleased about that you've had a chance to have a look at it and we'll have a chance to discuss it. I won't talk for very long because I think I want to get some of the contributors involved and obviously Eileen as well. But just on a couple of points to respond to comments made. Yes, radical doesn't appear in my introduction. That's a worrying oversight, but also I think partly because in exploring the idea in the chapters, it was so different in each chapter. Some elements were much more radical than others, some were more diffuse. In my own chapter on Jediism, I feel that actually it deflates slightly at the end. That I kind of conclude with that there's no great story of conflict between the canon and not canon, that actually a lot of Jedi have absorbed what they want and moved on, and their change is more organic as a part of the larger fandom culture in Star Wars, that actually this is a natural process for Jediism, and that they adopt retconning as discussed. So I think perhaps, yes, you're right, there could have been a section that explained more thoroughly what we meant by radical, where the lines could be drawn between radical and not radical, but I think the chapters in themselves demonstrate elements on that spectrum between more extreme change and disruption and more gentle organic change as well. I really enjoyed Linda's comments on another factor being ethical and moral leadership. I think that's a very interesting aspect that we didn't draw out directly, but obviously Eileen can probably speak more to that with her chapter and her research. I think we could, as Linda introduced, there's different levels of that. There's the personal virtues and character, the social phenomenon and individuals acting in particular ways and lived practices. But another level we might discuss as well is the assumption in some forms of public discourse about the ethics of actually producing new religious movements. So the sort of level above the individual and the group level, but the social level, how does society see the performance of new religious movements as a moral act or an immoral act? Quite often, that's how it's described. So I thought that was a very interesting comment that actually could have, yes, as you say, added another facet for us to think through these case studies with, another factor. Yeah, and it may well be Weber's fault that we don't talk about ethics and values. I think as someone who draws a lot on his three main factors, I think that's another aspect, another facet that really adds something to the discussion, especially around the concept of moral courage. I think that was very interesting. Yeah, and the points from Michael as well, just my final response, thinking about who we're writing for. I think I probably went into this project purely thinking about a more academic audience, but obviously with Inform being such a useful resource for so many people, that the outcome of where this book may be engaged with would be very different to my expectations from a more academic perspective. So that was a useful reminder of thinking of who we write for as well. So thank you. I just want to say again, thank you to the respondents. And also I noticed Margaret is also with us, Margaret Wilkins, who also did a fantastic job on the index. And I want to just quickly say my thanks to her. I'm embarrassing you, I'm sorry. But you know, all the contributors here as well have done a fantastic job, but Margaret as well. There's a slightly uncited in the book person, but she did a fantastic job as well. And I'd like to pass over to Eileen.
Thanks. Well, I've got to say something, but first thanks to the reviewers and thanks to the contributors and thanks to the Inform and of course Margaret, who saved me days of worry and work. The words good that Linda brought up, the introduction to my paper was the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. And what I've found over the last 100 years while I've been visiting new religions is that although I found them all eminently resistible myself and haven't wanted to join any of them, I have found an awful lot of good people. And I found a lot of good people who've stayed and a lot of good people who've left. And that's quite interesting because both of them share so much in their descriptions of the movement, but they sort of are tipped, as Michael mentioned, the difference between Anutama and Norrie. And that's what really made me think about it. I think one reason why we haven't been talking about it, Linda, is we have this great scare about being scientific, and words like good are bad because we're meant to be removed and not detached. And I think this is just so wrong. I think we've got to be objective and balanced. And but there's a difference. To go to Weber, who you were half blaming, he did make the distinction between value neutrality and value relevance. And I think we choose what we're studying because we have values, but we try to be neutral, which doesn't mean we don't care about it. In fact, I think the more we care, the more neutral we've got to be in our presentation or objective, which means that we're just describing as far as possible the objects, the data, the people, I hate to call them objects, rather than giving our own subjective ideas. So I think that that's probably why we've been a bit cagey about using words like good. Radical Jim, can I tell them a secret? It's not Beth's fault. We changed the title at the last minute and put radical in there because we thought it might be a bit more sexy than the rather boring title we had. And I'd already written, as you said, the diversification and revisionism. And now, obviously, we've got to do a third and a fourth and a fifth. If I weren't 100 myself, I'd love to do the one on the Far East, which I've been visiting and enjoying a lot lately, because there are lots of very exciting things going on in places like Korea and Vietnam and Japan, as you know. So yes, some of them do talk about radical change, some of them don't, but we did want to sell it, and we were talking about transformations, and we didn't just want to use the word change. I think I'm going to shut up there and let other people talk, but might want to come back later if Suzanne allows me to.
Fantastic. Thank you, everyone who's spoken so far. So now if the contributors would like to either raise a virtual hand or raise a physical hand, and if you'd like to say something about your experience with your editors or have any other comments on the discussion. I'm aware there are a lot of specific chapters that didn't get much of a look in. So if your chapter was one of those chapters, feel free to kind of say, this is my take on some of the questions about moral leadership or anything else. Go on, Shannon.
Hi, everyone. It's really lovely to be here and lovely to hear the responses from everyone. My chapter was on using a new religious movements framework to analyze lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender Muslim movements. And I think Linda's question about where the moral sits in our research has made me, if I could write this chapter again, maybe I would make that more explicit, because I think in the research on LGBT movements, that is the central question, because these are movements that have emerged in response to changing views of what constitutes acceptable morality and unacceptable morality that is implicated in, different political contexts, different interpretations of what is the secular, what is the religious, what is Islamic, what is not, and so on. And so much work focuses on that side of the divide that I don't think, I haven't come across a lot of work that really thinks about this moral contest when it comes to the emergence of LGBT Muslim groups. So I think that's a really interesting question. I think for me, the question is also about methodology and the position of the researcher, because I identify as gay and Muslim as well. So, as Linda was asking those questions, I was thinking, how would I approach this? Is there an ethic way that I can do this from the outside to think about this change of moral values and moral struggle? How would I do it from an emic perspective? How would it would almost have to be a telling of my story, my biography as well. How do I, I'm not being very articulate at the moment because I'm still thinking about it, but it did raise those questions for me. So as social scientists, if we wanted to approach that, how would we do it? How would we balance the ethic and the emic and so on?
Yeah, it's really great reflections for all of us who are professional academics or researchers, and also for those who are. Linda, you want to come back on that?
Sorry, it was a quick reaction to Shannon Shah. In your chapter, I think you were implicitly actually talking about values, but you put it under the heading of identity more. I think we often talk about values under other headings. So we talk a lot about it in relation to identity, as if identity is something value neutral. It's just sort of, I don't know, a positioning. And I think we talk about it also in some of the chapters. I think values were talked about, but under the heading of accommodation to wider society. But actually, what's often called minority accommodation to wider society is a values clash, and people pulled out of one movement because of competing values. And a lot of people leave religions because their values start to clash with the values of the religion. And I think so I think we do sort of look at them, but we don't like to use the word very much. And would it help if we did?
Great. A final call for contributors, and then if anyone would like to offer a reflection about any of the ideas mentioned by the respondents, or some of the subjects that you can see in the table of contents. I'm assuming that most of you haven't actually been able to get a hold of the book, given its price and its recent publication. So feel free to use this as an opportunity to discuss anything that's been raised or not raised that you think should be raised. Andre van der Beek.
Hi. Yes, yes, I wanted to say something briefly also because my article was mentioned by Jim Beckford about Andrew Cohen. One of the things that really struck me in writing my article, that the changes in this movement, which has been going on now for 35 years, that radical changes were actually caused by changes in worldview. So Andrew Cohen started with a particular philosophy of enlightenment, and then he changed his philosopher. He changed his philosophy. It became evolutionary enlightenment, impersonal enlightenment, and it was actually the change in worldview that led to the changes in practices. And I find this very interesting because worldview is much less popular as a category than it used to be in the time of Weber. And these days it's all about practices and social mechanisms. But I just wanted to say that also a kind of philosophical approach to the worldview of new religious movement can be fruitful in terms of explaining why changes happen. So I just wanted to bring that in.
Yeah, I found your chapter on the internal radical transformations that were kind of within Cohen himself was really fascinating. Any other contributors or people in the audience?
I think Philip Ruard wants to speak.
Ah, I see. Yep, go on, Philip.
I should really read the book before I say anything, but I will read the book. I'm a former Unification Church member, I have to say that the main transformational change within the movement in the UK, I think reflected a change of maturity, a growing up of the members, particularly when they had families. And I think many members felt that they wanted a more mature type of movement which listened to their views, and decisions were made more together. And I mean, the movement itself, the church has little communities, several communities in around the UK and also on the continent. I'm more familiar with the UK, particularly around London, which is where I live. And the communities are run really quite well, I would say. Whereas if you compare that to, say, in the mid-80s, there was a completely different culture. Most members didn't have families. The whole sort of organizational structure was far more autocratic. I think also members, we're generally quite young and inspired, and maybe not quite so, maybe more fanatical perhaps in those days in the mid-80s. But I think there was a very dramatic time in the mid-90s when we had a change of leadership in the UK. From a Japanese leader to a British leader, and it was a very positive change. We all felt we could breathe, but that's my own personal experience of a very localized situation in the UK with the Unification Church. Thank you.
Thanks for those personal reflections, Philip. Kim.
Thank you very much. Very good to be here. Really interested to hear the contributions that people have been making. And thank you all for your participation in this, what's obviously an excellent volume, which of course I have not yet got my hands on. So I just wanted to make a couple of points. The first one was about groups' own responses to the notion of change and transformation. So some of you may know that many years ago I did a lot of work over quite a long period of time on ISKCON, and it was at a time when the movement was struggling to come to terms with the idea of change, whether change was acceptable or not. So this was a theological problem that they had to deal with, about whether they should change or not, about whether you could change as a movement and still be true to your theological principles. So I think that itself is an important aspect of thinking about how groups themselves struggle with the notion of change and whether or not they actually find that acceptable or not. The other thing that I wanted to say was that Beth, in her comments, asked who are we writing for? And of course, one group that we always hope that we're writing for when we write about minority religions is students. And certainly in my experience of teaching students, they're very often surprised to learn that minority religions can change. Often because they are exposed to a kind of snapshot of movements at particular points in their life and so on. And because sometimes they're exposed to minority religions through the media and so on, where they may get a particular impression of what those movements are like, whether they are good or bad, and so on. So students, I think, are quite a challenging audience, but at the same time, they're a really good audience, because when you point out to them how these kind of movements actually do change, they're often extremely surprised. I remember students being absolutely astonished to learn that minority religions might be at the cutting edge, for example, of technological change. That they might have the capacity to reinvent themselves, to engage in processes of revisionism and so on, and that they might be capable of moral change as well. So I think we do have a kind of obligation from the perspective of teaching about minority religions, not something I have to do myself these days, but to surprise them with, as James said, with our understanding and knowledge of the kind of longitudinal processes that these movements go through, because students themselves often have quite a narrow understanding, quite a set within a particular time frame of what a particular movement looks like. So thank you very much.
Great, thanks for those reflections, Kim. Mike Andreas, I'm sorry if I butchered your name, but please unmute yourself.
Never mind. Thanks. I got to know Inform through my studies at King's and with Muerte, and I'm glad to be able to join online today. And many thanks for the intriguing introduction and the responses. In Germany, where I'm from, there's quite a debate also in the realm of religious studies about populism, and more recently with COVID on conspiracy movements. And they've drawn a lot on the research on minority religions. And there's a lot of interest in the role of new mass media, such as social media, messenger groups, Telegram, for radical change or radicalization of such groups, conspiracy groups and movements. I think Professor Linda Wood had touched on it briefly, where this featured in the book. I've not read it either, but in fact, I was expecting to hear something about it from Professor Beckford. So for me, as a prospectus reader, could you give us some sort of perhaps reading aid where we can find something in that various chapters of on that relation between mediatization, mass media, and radical change in minority religions? Does it feature there? And if not, is it not something that's happening, or what role do you see it playing? Thanks.
The speaker's going to have a moment to reject. Is that Beth coming in?
No, I was just asking if Eileen wanted to come in on that, or whether okay. No, it's a really good point. I think some of the things I've looked at more previously in my research has been more around kind of conspirituality and the effect of that kind of mass dissemination of particular threads of conspiracy thinking. Yeah, there's nothing, I think, specifically in the chapters I'm thinking of that gets into the very current situation with online misinformation I think there's definitely a space for drawing in, as Jim said as well, some research on social movements where that some social movements overlap between the boundary between the religious and the non-religious is very hard to draw, but something like QAnon, where it also draws in Christian evangelicals, but it has this, it's a social movement in itself, but also the spirituality element and the overlap with some new age cultures as well. It's kind of, it's a Venn diagram of all the things you're talking about there. And I suppose, again, as Eileen said, if we could carry on to volumes 3, 4, 5, we could get a wonderful chapter from someone, I'm sure, on QAnon, because it's still bubbling over at the moment, and certainly having an impact also on British popularism and the kinds of statements that are being made in our state apparatus. So yeah, absolutely, that's a very fair point. And I think some of the chapters certainly do touch on the relationship between new religious movements and dissemination through the internet, but not as much perhaps on that misinformation popularism aspect. Someone wants to correct me and remind me of what I've forgotten.
Yeah, it's certainly an intriguing area that I'm sure will be researched much more in the time to come. I think one thing that people often forget about was, like, there was quite a lot of attention on the abuse aspect, and I think people forget how much the internet and social media has been used to network survivors and to enable change within new religions by enabling horizontal communication, which might have been kind of avoided by the leadership in the past. Susan Palmer wants to come in.
Yes, that was a very good point, Suzanne Newcomb. I remember when, you know, I think one of the first second generation websites called Voice was formed in the Hare Krishna, and the, you know, the young people who were talking about their abuse experiences, and their parents and everyone was just shocked. And if it weren't for the internet, of course, this wouldn't have been possible. And so anyway, one thing I really like about this book, of course I haven't read it yet, is there's data on, you know, harm to children, and there's a sophisticated discussion. And of course, this is a very touchy topic, and it's a very complicated topic. And there's much to be said, you know, in defense of groups, but also much to be said on, you know, on the harm that has happened or is happening in some groups. And the other problem, of course, is that the media tends to focus on a scandal that happened 20 years ago and then completely ignore the resolution. For example, when the 12 tribes were raided in 1984 because of, you know, spankings, and then they don't tend to mention that the judge sent everybody home because he dismissed the charges. Or the same thing about the family children of God, that, you know, they focus on the lurid details of the flirty fishing era, and they don't mention that in the 90s, when there was these international raids in Australia, Argentina, France, and so on, that around 600 children were examined by doctors and psychiatrists, and there was no evidence of any abuse, simply because the group had gone through a big change, you know. So right now I'm entering my final year of a Shirk-funded research project called Children in Sectarian Religions and State Control at McGill University. And so one of the things we're looking at, of course, is the issue of harm. And so it's really great that there's more material coming out on this and more nuanced approaches, and just generally more data. So we'll certainly be quoting it in our book. We're writing a volume called Hiding from Herod, if you note the biblical reference. And we'll certainly be, you know, looking at that book. And it'll be, I can see it being valuable for scholars in the future who go to family court. And anyways, I guess that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thanks, Susan. I'm looking for more questions from the audience or reflections from anyone. I mean, I am fascinated by the social media and internet question, and I think we're only just starting to understand the varied ways it affects us, and get enough distance to start to analyze it properly.
Eileen is waving her hand.
Oh, sorry, I can't see you. I'm looking for the electronic hands. Go on, Eileen, just unmute yourself.
Sorry. Could I ask the people, the contributors, to say just a bit about their chapters, what they've done, because although the reviewers did tell us a bit, there are quite a few people who are here, and it would be nice if they could just give us a sentence or two about what they were trying to say in their chapters about change and their perspective. Because we've got a variety, we've got lawyers and we've got members, former members, as well as academics. And I think it would be helpful, as other people aren't rushing in and they probably don't know what to say, and it might give the discussion a bit of a whoosh.
Thank you very much, Eileen. That's a great suggestion. I can start. Shai, go on.
Yes, so my chapter was on what I termed as the ecofeminist turn within the, let's call it the neo-pagan milieu in the UK during the 70s and the 80s, late 70s and the 1980s. That's a subject that has been covered, say, regarding the 19th period, the 1990s period in the UK. We saw that the road protests movement within neo-pagans there. But I wanted to talk about something which happened a bit more earlier, and basically my case study was a magazine and a group that revolved around it. This magazine was called Wood and Water. And it's really started as a quaint little magazine having to do with sacred wells in like Cornwall, and grew from there to a goddess-centered neo-pagan ecofeminist magazine, which also was not just satisfied with just creating this platform, but also the editors and the members did a lot of like events and festivals and retreats and everything. They really were talking about creating even schools for teaching children and educating them with ecofeminist values, although this never materialized. So in many ways, what we consider today to be the norm, yeah, within modern paganism, we can actually see the roots of this over there in the late 70s, early 80s. It's not that earlier Wiccans didn't have any ecological awareness, but it wasn't something that was really considered crucial to Wiccan theology, for instance, and things like that. So late 70s and early 80s were a really crucial period in that regard. Yeah.
Fabulous, thanks. Really interesting. Who else is here? I see Bernard. Do you want to say anything?
Yep, I could just say briefly. I'm an old-fashioned, boring historian rather than a sociologist, I should say. And unfortunately, Laura got caught in the crossfire of this. So our chapter is very much descriptive piece, just looking at the situation in Australia. The Plymouth Brethren Christian Church went through a period in the mid-2000s in Australia where, for a series of sort of circumstances that came together at once, became very controversial. There was a lot of smoke, very little fire in this, but it turned them into a very sort of popular group for the media, and particular facets of the media, to kind of really hone in on. And every time something happened in the Brethren, they'd decide to build a meeting hall, and local communities would get up in arms because they'd see it all. It's like, oh, this secretive organization, what are they doing behind these fences? And so we decided to look at sort of some of the ways in which sort of that's changed, not their core beliefs necessarily, but as David said earlier, but more the way in which they've shifted sort of how they've engaged with outside society in terms of communicating those in particular, and also particularly how those changes have been received in the substantial ex-member community, many of whom are quite aggrieved with their experience, and they viewed these changes in a particular way. So what we sought to do in our chapter was very much to sort of foreground both voices, so explaining sort of from a voice of the emic perspective of members in the Brethren, looking at some of their ministry writings, for instance, how they viewed some of the changes, and then looking at talking to some of the ex-members and how they sort of viewed it from the outside. And we use the kind of the provocation of calling it revision or rebranding. And this was playing, as those who get to read the chapter will see, on a media report in Australia from A Current Affairs, which is a notorious tabloid television program, in which they they talked about the Brethren's new PR strategy. And it was a really bizarre report. If anyone has seen it, those who are familiar with the Plymouth Brethren will know they very much come out of an evangelical milieu, or low church evangelical Protestant milieu. But the sort of trappings they used on the report were like candles, and made it look very like Roman Catholic and high Gothic. And it was quite a bizarre kind of report. And so it sort of got us thinking a bit more there. So yeah, Laura, would you like to add anything?
Oh, that's great. Thanks, Bernard. I haven't had enough coffees this morning to.
Yes, so we should say it's about 5 minutes to 6 a.m. this morning, and so I'm uncaffeinated. So. Thank you.
I'm very impressed, and thank you very much for joining us on Australian time. We also had another comment emphasizing the importance of longer term studies and updating studies, and that's something this book is really good at, and something we try to do at Inform, but it's often really needs ongoing research because there's so much change and so much diversification, which was the subject of another one of the book series. I think that there's some of the go on, Eileen.
Frank Cranmer's got his hand up.
Yeah,
Go on, Frank.
Right, it's a physical hand because I can't work out how to do the icon.
Sorry, I'm scanning through, but I don't always catch it.
Yeah. Briefly, what Russell and I tried to do in our chapter was to look at how English and Scots law dealt with new religious movements, and suggested that they dealt with them in a pretty patchy way. One of the reasons we suggest is because, particularly going back to a judgment in 1970 called Segadal, judges have tended to look at religion very much in a Christian Judeo context, and have found it quite difficult to think outside that particular box. The other thing is that the courts have tended to look at religion corporately, and whereas we all know that the European Convention on Human Rights, Article 9, protects the right to freedom of religion or belief, both in its manifestation and in the beliefs that you hold, the UK courts have been much better at recognizing external manifestations, the forum externum, and rather less good at understanding internal manifestations,
So there has been a tendency, as was witnessed in the case of Ueda and British Airways, that if it wasn't mandated by your religion in the global sense, you couldn't claim the right to do it. As it turned out, the European Court of Human Rights reversed the UK courts on that. And hopefully, that'll be a new departure, and individual religious choices will be given greater account. But, it's a work in progress. So that's basically what ours was about.
Fabulous. Thanks for that addition. It's really, I think, important to get all these different perspectives of not just academics on the movements. We've got Mark first and then Michael. Mark?
Yes, hello there. Thank you so very much for this presentation. I did a research in the Icelandic Asatru community in 2018, and I have found out that they are trying to distance themselves from the American group, namely the Asatru Folk Assembly, especially because their affiliation with the far right and these, how should I put it, very, very uncool activities. And I see this as a reaction to a reaction, namely distancing themselves to that point in which they intentionally exclude specific ritualistic elements of their own rituals and emptifying their own ritual practices to completely alienate themselves from the Asatru Folk Assembly, and I found it very, very fascinating. Yeah, that's my note. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. And Michael Strumska, did you want to come in?
Yeah, Mark, I would verify what you're saying. I've encountered that too in meetings with the Icelandic Asatru people. They basically want nothing to do with American Asatru for fear that a lot of it is racist and right-wing. I think it is so true that American Asatru has a huge racial problem, to just put it very, very simply. But I raised my hand to just suggest, I don't know if it's taken up in papers in the book, but a good direction for research, excuse me, in the near future is the overlap of right-wing racist and nativist politics, not only in Asatru, but in other religious movements. And in the States, actually, I shouldn't just say the States, I think it's pretty international. There are some people who've been looking at the very weird overlap of new agey things with right-wingy kinds of things. But in a sense, it's nothing new, is it? I mean, we go back to the great grandmama of us all, Madame Blavatsky, and she was quite a racist in her own right. So a lot of the new agey stuff has had that shadow hovering over it. So I think this will be interesting to look at more in the future. Thank you.
Great. Fantastic pagan interlude. Any final thoughts about radical transformations and the book as a whole before we call it a night? So maybe if each of the reviewers just might say a final sum up sentence or two, and then that would make a nice close for the evening. So let's go in reverse order this time. Let's have Jim, then Michael, then Linda, and then we'll all.
Okay, thank you very much. Really interesting discussion. Too much to take in at one go, but as I was listening to the discussion, two things occurred to me. One is on the topic of relations with the literature on social movements. And here I can get in one of my favorite words, imbrication. Imbrication is the form that the scales on the side of a fish make. They are partially overlapping. And I've heard so many people talking in this session about how some of these minority religions are partially overlapped with other traditions within themselves or with other movements, etc., etc. And it seemed to me that it would be helpful if somebody could try to think that all through, try to come up with a scheme. Perhaps Eileen would design one of her wonderful little figure diagrams that would show us how all these things fit together or don't. And especially when QAnon was mentioned, my ears pricked up. This could be very interesting indeed. The other thing, and this is on the topic of harm, we've heard a lot about sexual abuse of children, and nothing is more important than that. But at the same time, thinking about the lifespan of some of these movements, there are old people in these movements too, and there are old people who've left them. And surely the time is ripe now for some, perhaps somebody's doing it, and I'm talking out of ignorance, but surely the time is ripe for some good research now on the situation of, let me call them older people, in minority religions. I would certainly be very interested in reading that.
That's great. I remember Eileen was trying to do some work on that, and we indeed Inform had a meeting on that, but I think there is much more research that needs to be done. And I know David's done some Venn diagrams on overlaps with conspiracy milieus and QAnon that are really helpful, and far right and far left. But again, these overlaps are much more pervasive than we often think about. So that's another really good intervention for a future article. Michael.
Yeah, I mean, something that sort of struck me is how desperately we need really good quantitative research. You know, coming from a psychological perspective, quantitative research that uses measures that will assess distress. Claire's comment about the 1,000 people who, you know, are somewhat lost as the family is unraveling would be a marvelous research opportunity if you could get access to a reasonably large sample from that group. You know, the quantitative research would be so much useful to have, but of course the downside of that, it takes a lot more manpower and time and money to do it. But we need it. I mean, there's some good stuff, but we need much more.
Yeah, that's a really important observation. It's very tricky to do that, but could be very helpful. And Linda, would you like to have the last words?
Well, it's been a really interesting discussion. I'm glad the contributors said a bit about their many contributions, and picking that up in relation to Jim's opening point about doing the study of new religious movements in relation to the study of new social movements, NRMs and NSMs, putting them back together. I think we've just heard that the contributors also say, they don't just say, they say a lot about not just how NSMs affect NRMs, but the other way around. So as Kim said, you know, students often find it very surprising that new religious movements can be very productive for significant change in wider movements. And we've just heard about how the alt-right has got lots of roots, very, very important roots in Asatru and neo-paganism. And similarly, we heard about NRM's influence and neo-paganism's influence and on the ecological movement in various ways, more mainstreaming of it. So it's really interesting. That's another theme that is there in the book, but isn't pulled out, but another really interesting contribution that it makes. I'm still also, finally, I'm going to have to talk to Eileen, because I think Eileen answered my point with one side of her brain, and her point about good men was made with the other side of her brain. So I think you've got a Weber compartment to your brain, Eileen. and when you're studying the new religious movement art, because when you talk about good men and women, are you being value neutral? You seem to be commending value neutrality in social science, but you're making moral judgments, aren't you, when you're talking about good and bad women? I think we'll have to continue this conversation. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Linda. That's an excellent and a question to Eileen. Don't know that she wants to talk about it now. But thank you all so much for coming. And thank you, editors and contributors, for putting together a fantastic volume with lots of food for thought. And there's been lots of points raised that will be fruit for future students and future researchers to take forward. And I really hope people do that, and that we see all those new insights and new research at future informed seminars and future publications. So thank you all very much for being here.